Hello, this is From Caracas and I am Ray Gomez. On the links between the African culture and the African descendants in Venezuela, I will talk with Reinaldo Bolívar, Director of the Center of African, American and Caribbean Studies. How are you, Professor?
How do you do, Ray?
Very good, thank you. Let's start by defining what the Center of African Studies is.
The African, American and Caribbean Knowledge Center is an institution for strategic research on Africa and its diaspora in America and the Caribbean. It was an initiative that was taken at the second summit from South Africa, America, made in Margarita in 2009, opened by President Hugo Chavez, and with the presence of at least 40 leaders between South Americans and Africans. The main idea was to study each other. Africans study America, Americans study Africa, both study Latin America and Caribbean. The center is mainly devoted to research for decision-making.
What lines of investigation characterize the Center of African Studies?
The first line of research is the exhaustive study of the contributions of Africa, America and the Caribbean that are not widely known, but that issue sets the principles of the technological transfer of a continent to another, even though the way it was done, which was slavery, but it has left important traces in agriculture, in culture, in gastronomy, in music, in sciences, among others. Then there is a line of research that is linking Africa with the other great cultures of the world. For example, Africa-Russia, Africa-Iran, Africa-India, Africa-Europe, Africa-North America. What is the purpose? To discover how these great cultures interact, in any case, also great civilizations, through the history of mankind and how they behave today in the geostrategic landscape.
So we could say that Africa is practically the center of the cultures, the old cultures, following the scientific theory that Africa was certainly the territory where the human being was born, the so-called Homo sapiens, and by that, where the migration to other territories started.
You have said it. That's right. That's why Africa is the cradle of humanity, cradle of great cultures. We study the rest of the world and how that Africa interacts. We have found that today, in this 21st century, Africa became the world economic center. Of course, you say that, and someone could be amazed. Why Africa, the world economic center? Because it is the center of the great natural resources. Africa is the main source of minerals, the second source of water, 20% hydrocarbon energy. In addition, it is a continent that possesses large fertile lands, a practically virgin continent within 30 million square kilometers, only has 1 billion inhabitants. If you compare it to India, which is a quarter of the territory of Africa, it has already 1 billion inhabitants. And if you compare it Africa to China, that China is the third of Africa, it has almost 2 billion inhabitants. Africa has large lands. In fact, we're studying with much interest the European neocolonialism towards Africa, where there are now renting land that do not benefit Africans themselves. Why? Africa, it is a very important fact. The 70% of food consumption in Europe comes from Africa. That fact makes you think about the importance of this continent.
It's something like a big storage.
It's like a big warehouse, and then the concern is, if it is the center of the world economy by the economic extraction they make of it, you can turn African countries into important powers.
It is one of the continents where you can observe the most of inequality.
There is a total polarization between rich and poor in Africa. Although there has been an important process of economic growth between 2002 and 2012, according to the studies we have made and the sources we have, of the 10 world's fastest growing economies, 7 are in Africa. Now, we see that these 7 African economies of global growth, inequality continues. Why? Because Africa is taxed by big European corporations. There are more than 2,000 corporations or European transnational corporations that use African natural resources and take advantage of the workforce. Of these forced migrations, there are a lot of African citizens in Europe that are contributing, as always, to the development of Europe, but at the expense of the involution of some African countries. However, Africa has, and this is extremely transcendental, perhaps the best political organizations in the world today, including, for example, the African Union, which brings together the 55 African countries and that has shown a political coherence unseen in the rest of the integration agencies and multilateral world.
What do you think? Is that coherence of the African organization due to the tribal foundations?
To its ethnic base, to the relationship of belonging. You can get yourself a Guinean, an Ethiopian, a South African, a Mali. Then you ask him, "Who are you?" And he says to you, "First, I belong to my ethnic group." For example, Mali says, "First, I'm a Wolof," or the Ethiopian says, "First, I'm an América," or the African tells you, "First, I'm a Zulu, then I'm an African, and in the third place I am from Mali, from Ethiopia, from Egypt," and so on.
That sense of ownership is not much observed in the rest of the continents.
Totally. In Africa you go to any of the capitals or big cities and you always see the map of Africa on roads, in a product brand.
Like their big country.
It is their great country. Sadly, in our region, South America, we don't see it like that. We don't contemplate it. Africans have a great sense of belonging. The African always tells you, "I'm an African, I come from Africa," and it is important. They also preserve the linguistic unity. The Bantu, which is the great language of the sub-Saharan countries from which they derive, about 2,000 languages, is spoken by at least 80% of Africans.
Going back to the Center of African and Caribbean Studies, we would like to know which events you host, nationally and internationally speaking.
The Center of African, American and Caribbean Knowledge is a reference. We can say with property, it's a reference to the southern peoples. We annually conduct an international congress on African and Caribbean knowledge that this year celebrated its 5th edition, and some countries of the Caribbean of Africa, mainly and always under an annual thematic unit. This year, for example, we made the reparations, a debt of the North with the South, with presentations of South Africa, of Senegal, of Jamaica, of Puerto Rico, Cuba, the United States, Venezuela, among others. Last year was dedicated to the legacy of Fidel Castro. The Knowledge Center also sponsors graduates constantly, courses of professional extension in which, first, it was directed to public officials, in the interest that the Venezuelan public officials could have a deep knowledge of the Africanity and the countries of the South. We have the diploma in African knowledge, where there is history, geography, politics, culture. We have a diploma in insular Caribbean, the Caribbean islands. It seems a lie, but here in Venezuela there was much talk about the Caribbean, but little was known about the Caribbean. The best known are Cuba, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico.
Like the Hispanic Caribbean. So there is a Caribbean that is still hidden, and I consider that humanity is in big debt to them by not seeing them. The French Caribbean, the countries that were from the Netherlands in a moment and are still considered as sub-colonies.
That Caribbean is not widely known, and that Caribbean has an important history of fighting colonialism against imperialism. That Caribbean has great characters. It has history, it has production. What we teach here and has had an important success, in addition to the diploma that is made for the public in general, even the Chancellery has asked us for diplomas for their staff. We have a diploma in anti-imperialist struggles, which, according to some experts who have come to Venezuela, it's unique in America. It is a graduate who studies the great revolution that have been in America, its validity, its failures, its successes, its prospect. We're doing it here.
And the participation of the Afro-descendants in the revolution.
Of course. And now we're launching 3 new courses. There is great interest in them, and we already have several cohorts. Now we have a course in strategic relations between Russia and Africa. Another course is focused on the strategic relations between China and Africa. And another is strategic relations between Iran and Africa. And soon a course of strategic relations between Africa and the Arab countries. In Africa, there are at least 10 countries that belong to the League of Arab States, and Africa has not less than 50% of the population practicing Islamism. So that links us internationally, as well as constant seminars. Speaking about the 100 years of the Bolshevik Revolution, this Center of African, American, and Caribbean knowledge was the driving force of the celebration of those 100 years. Here was made a whole year of a seminar on the legacy of the Russian socialist revolution in the world, and concluded with the 100 years that the Venezuelan government decreed. Also, a few days ago here in Venezuela were made a day of Afro-descendant peoples, whose subject was the repairs, where the center gave a great contribution. We have a great slogan for the center, which is the vanguard of thinking in Venezuela. Here are great thinkers, small thinkers, medium thinkers, acquaintances and strangers, but who are constantly doing strategic research. We have international agreements with several countries, with the University of South Africa, with the University Eduardo Mondlane of Mozambique, with the Foundation Agostinho Neto of Angola, with the Amilcar Cabral University of Guinea-Bissau, with 3 universities in Egypt, with the Casa Africa of Cuba, besides relations with some institutions of Cuba like the Institute of Solidarity with the Peoples, the ICAP, with the Franz Fanon Foundation of Martinique, in addition to at least 10 Venezuelan universities that are within the framework of African studies. That is to say that the center is a reference and it is an engine of activities of Africanity, the peoples of the South and the Afro-descendants.
Speaking of Africans, the peoples of the South and the Afro-descendants, we would like to dedicate a few minutes of our program to characterize the Afro-Venezuelan culture. What are its main characteristics?
Yes, we should begin saying briefly that the African presence in Venezuela is originated by slavery. It is mainly from provenance of West Africa, between Senegal and Nigeria and the Congos. That's why we talk here of some relationship with the Congos, some Congolese music in the West African part. You can identify similar gastronomy, the consumptions of grains and meats, or fried plantain, for example, the way to prepare the rice. You can identify, for example, the houses of adobe. Almost all the colonial architecture that there is in Venezuela is awarded to the Spanish, but it is African architecture. Those big churches, the Vela de Coro, that's African work. Africans already had a great architectural experience in prefabricated technology. That inheritance is present in Venezuela.
Volviendo al tema de la culinaria, entiendo que uno de los platos venezolanos por excelencia, que es la yaca, se debe.
Back to the topic of culinary, there is a Venezuelan dish of excellence called hallaca that came from African slaves in the country at the time.
That's right. The owner, the so-called master, threw things that Africans gathered, and so the hallaca is so varied. It is a collage of food, as varied is the Venezuelan society.
How varied is the Venezuelan society?
We have an ethnic presence, 54% of African origin.
You mean the majority?
It's a majority. Since the last census of 2011, although it was not so disclosed, Venezuelans do recognize themselves as 50% Morenos, 2% black and 2% Afro. But all of that comes from Africa, from sub-Saharan Africa, directly, because we know that all humanity comes from Africa as such. But there is an Africa located at the south of the Sahara, which population developed the most pigmented skin to protect themselves from sunlight.
Y fue una de las razones también que motivó a los colonizadores europeos importar.
And one of the reasons was also that European colonizers imported Africans because of their anatomical characteristics, resistant to the climates of our countries.
Yes, especially sugarcane plantations made in the Caribbean and much of the South and the center of America, with a tropical climate, located between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. Goes through Africa, America, and some Asian countries. So, as you said, they brought these people, uprooted families. There was a great genocide. We are currently on the issue of repairs. What are the repairs? Demanding the imperial powers that 400 years ago caused two great genocides. 60% of Africa between 1500s and 1800s was killed by slavery, and 90% of our America from the 1490s and 90 to the 1800s also died. Then there is also a great genocide, and reparations are being demanded, the satisfaction, the asking for forgiveness, the restitution of the stolen works that art were driven to Europe and the United States. There are grades of art that are in British and Parisian museums that belong to Africa or our America. And then compensation, because the underdevelopment of our countries is due to these great genocides. A decrease in the population which did not allow to be fulfilled. The classical role of the economy: the greater the population, the greater the development. Likewise, the stagnation of self-development that Africa and America had, despite they were impressive cultures, even higher than the European.
The pre-Columbian cultures.
Precisely, pre-Columbian cultures or African cultures.
Tal cual. Ahora bien, esas culturas africanas llegan a América forzadas por el proceso migratorio.
Now, those African cultures came to South America enforced by the immigration process that empowered drastically the European colonizers, and as you just said, they mixed with the cultures that already were living here, other than Europeans. Is Venezuela a product of that?
El venezolano de hoy es una síntesis, una sincronía, una sinergia.
The Venezuelan of today are a synthesis, a synchrony, a synergy of cultures, identities. So we speak of a great identity, a great national identity, the great national identity of our America. And today's Venezuelan has important component. As our liberator Simón Bolívar said, he said clearly, it is more than European and that of the North. It is more African and American. But of course, there is a coincidence. Of course, Bolivar had an important thesis. The European who arrived in Venezuela, that they came from Spain, but those Spaniards had been conquered for 800 years by the Moors of Africa, so the African component is still much stronger in us. But that makes us Venezuelans unique, because we take the joy, we take the spirituality, we take the resistance, we take the stubbornness, we take the hope. The African is hope, it is spirituality. The European is stubborn, that conquest in which he pawned his stubbornness, even with all the damage he did. But yet, the European had his own internal wars and survived. That is commendable. Its own slavery, the aboriginal is spiritual, it is natural, it is pacifist, it is ecologist. That is what we Venezuelans are, that synergy, that ethnic synthesis that characterizes so much.
Is the Bolivarian Revolution also heritage of the African culture?
President Hugo Chavez recognized himself as Afro-descendant. President Maduro assumed it like that. Chavez always spoke of the Mother Africa. There is a hero of the independence that I'm currently studying. His name is Juan Germán Rocio Nieves, mestizo, who said, Spain is a stepmother because only a stepmother can treat their sons and daughters badly. And Chavez said, the mother is Africa, because the development of humanity is thanks to Africa. There is one important thing for us. After our original fathers and mothers fell, our natives, first fighting for our independence, the relay is African. They appear after Guaycaipuro, then appear Miguel de Guria, appear José Leonardo Chirinos, Andrés Rosario Note, Matea, Hipólita. Then we heard of that. That was well understood by Simón Bolívar when on June 2 of the year 1816, when he decreed the abolition of slavery and said, for you and your descendants to join the freedom of Venezuela and have the same rights and duties.
How true is that Simón Bolívar had African descent?
Yes, he had a great-grandmother of African descent, it is proven. But more than African descent, he had an African education. He was formed by the Negra Matea Bolívar and the Negra Hipólita Bolívar, who were the most important women in the life of the liberator Simón Bolívar. Very important, without taking away merit from other women. But they were the ones who gave him his first lessons. Says the legend that Bolívar said in the year 1827 on arriving in Caracas, there are Hipólita who gave me the food and Matea who taught me my first steps. Then when Bolívar promises to Pétion the freedom of the slaves, it's not a promise to Pétion, it's that Bolívar was sensitized. He grew up in the surroundings of his house with black children, mestizos children, white children. He believed in freedom and believed in equality.
On the basis of all that obviously is part of the curriculum of the study of the Center of African and Caribbean Studies, what perspectives does it have?
Perspectives? We're looking for more links with the center to contribute more to the development of inclusionist policies in Venezuela. We give to the Constituent National Assembly our constitutional proposal, not only in the part of the rights of Afro-descendants, in every way comes inclusive. So, we think we do a strategic management and we want to establish a greater link with some institutions in the world. We have already done it, as I said before. We're still working on it because we think that knowledge is a power. The exercise of active knowledge is a power, and it is important because it removes bandages, gives waves, and lightens up. So, the perspective is to continue our congresses. To address new areas of knowledge, we have a website, saberesafricanos.net. We provide research to other governments, other groups that serve to unify and combat. To combat, above all, the oppression that still looms most strongly about our countries. The battlefield of knowledge is imperative. Our liberator Simón Bolívar said that, by ignorance, we are enslaved more than by weapons.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this interview for Telesur English.
Remember, this is From Caracas. I'm Ray Gomez, and on the links between the African culture and the African descendants in Venezuela, I have been talking with Reinaldo Bolívar, director of the Center of African, American, and Caribbean Studies. Thank you very much.